When I was 19, I took my first self-defense class, and it changed my life. I wanted to feel safe. I had already survived sexual violence, and like a lot of survivors, I thought what happened to me was my fault. What I learned in self-defense was that I had been really misinformed about sexual violence, what it is, whose fault it is, who perpetrates it, and what works to prevent it. And by being so misinformed, I had been set up to be victimized and to blame myself. I was so galled by this that over the next 30 years, I went on to become a self-defense teacher myself, and later a social worker, serving other survivors. What I've learned in this work is that most people are really misinformed about sexual violence. And I've come to believe that if we were armed with the truth, we could end it for ourselves and for each other. So what do I mean when I say sexual violence? The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, defines it very simply as sexual activity when consent is not obtained or is not freely given. Sexual violence can be committed by physical force or by the threat of physical force. It can be facilitated by the victim being unconscious or impaired by drugs or alcohol. Or it can be coerced when a person uses their power or influence to compel another person to submit. The CDC uses this umbrella term, contact sexual violence, to describe all kinds of forced sexual touching with fingers, mouths, genitals, or objects. It includes the subcategory of rape, which is very specifically defined as unwanted penetration. For those of us who have been hurt in this way, and those of us who care deeply for people who have been hurt in this way, it can be very painful to bear witness to these ugly things. And these ugly things impact so very many of us. The CDC estimates that 1 in 3 US women, or about 44 million, have experienced some kind of contact sexual violence. To give you an idea of how many people that is, it's the population of California, plus the population of Delaware, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, and Vermont. About half that many US men, or 1 in 6, have experienced contact sexual violence, and it's estimated that half of all transgender Americans have been sexually assaulted. Sexual violence is so prevalent that it's a hidden commonality in every group, in your workplace, in your school, in your faith community, in your family. Which is why I have to tell you the first thing I learned in self-defense. If you are sexually assaulted, it is not your fault. It is not your fault. There is one person responsible for any act of sexual violence, and that is the person who chooses to perpetrate it. We know whose fault this is. I was so lucky that I signed up for a very particular kind of self-defense. It was developed by and for women, many of whom were survivors, and it's come to be known as empowerment self-defense, or ESD. ESD is really different from other kinds of self-defense. It doesn't rely on scare tactics or fancy martial arts moves. Empowerment self-defense instructors teach awareness, communication, and simple physical techniques to deal with the most common types of harassment and assault. ESD students come away empowered with a toolkit of facts and skills to lead bolder, safer lives. And ESD works. 2 recent high-quality academic studies found that ESD reduces the risk of sexual assault by about half. In a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2015, researchers found that Canadian college women who received ESD-style training had a risk of completed rape 46% lower than their untrained peers. Annual sexual assault rates among a group of adolescent girls in Kenya decreased by 60% after they received ESD training. That study was published in the journal Pediatrics. We don't know exactly what makes ESD so effective, but there are 3 truths at the heart of empowerment self-defense that stand in contrast to the misinformation most of us received about sexual violence. The first truth: you are more likely to be hurt by someone you know. Most of us are much more familiar with the term stranger danger than we are with these facts. 92% of attempted and completed rapes against women are committed by somebody they know. Almost half are committed by a current or former intimate partner. When we know the truth that we are overwhelmingly more likely to be assaulted by somebody we know, we're much better prepared for that possibility. And even if we are assaulted by a stranger, we're safer when we know the second truth. A person's behavior can predict if they're likely to hurt us. Students will often come to an empowerment self-defense class asking what they can do in the worst, most dangerous moment of an assault. Of course they do. But as a teacher, I would ask my students, would it be okay for us to unpack that? Can we think about what might have happened before that moment? And what happened before that? And what happened before that? Because we're trying to build our awareness of the very earliest warning signs that a sexual assault might happen. See, we know that there are behaviors that might indicate that a person is likely to perpetrate. And these behaviors can be observed sometimes long before there's any danger. These behaviors include things like lack of empathy and general aggressiveness, unconsented touch, and inappropriately intimate or sexualized conversation, threatening body language, and behaving violently. Some researchers call these possible pre-rape behaviors. They don't tell us for sure that a person will perpetrate, but they do give us clues. And the reason empowerment self-defense instructors unmask these clues is because of the third truth. Rapid, forceful resistance works. Fighting back works. It works to interrupt and defend against sexual assault. In a 2014 analysis of data from the National Crime Victimization Survey, researchers found that most self-protective actions were effective in interrupting rape completion. The most effective strategies were moving away, running, driving, hiding, locking a door, calling out or otherwise attracting attention, physically struggling, and unarmed strikes. There's a myth that if you fight back, you'll get hurt worse. This study proved that's not true. Together, these strategies reduced the risk of rape completion by over 80%, with no significant increase in injury to the intended victim. Fighting back works most of the time. When it doesn't work, it's not because the person fighting back did anything wrong. You shouldn't have to fight back in the first place. Now here's what I think is the most amazing part of the empowerment self-defense research. In a study of US college women, those who received ESD training were not simply less likely to be raped if attacked. They were less likely to be attacked at all. And other research has supported this finding. So ESD teaches you skills for fighting back. But just taking an ESD class means it's less likely you'll need to fight back. How is that possible? We think the magic is in the combination of accurate assessment and rapid response. Imagine the ESD-trained student who's experiencing one of those possible pre-rape behaviors. Let's say somebody's persistently touching her upper thigh. If she takes that hand off her thigh, stands up, and walks away, she might never know if it was a warning sign of something worse. All she knows is she didn't like it, and she took quick action to make it stop. Prevention is hard to prove because the bad thing doesn't happen. When you put snow tires on your car, you don't drive around all winter thinking that you're avoiding an accident every time you hit the brakes. You just think your car is stopping. You never know what might have happened. And this is the sweet spot where we think empowerment self-defense has the power to interrupt not just individual assaults, but the culture that supports sexual violence. In the gray area, when you don't know what will happen next. Because our culture actually normalizes the early warning signs of sexual violence. These things happen so often without escalating that we all become desensitized to them. It's confusing. Some people will touch without consent, tell tasteless jokes, sexually objectify other people, and that's as far as they're going to go. But when we routinely tolerate, dismiss, and minimize these kinds of intrusions, it starts to feel like they're not a big deal, even when our instincts are telling us otherwise. So we've all seen the baby who, for whatever reason, just does not want a kiss from grandma. The baby cries out, they pull away. We know when something doesn't feel right. Just telling you that list of possible pre-rape behaviors, I started to get that not okay feeling. It's not okay for someone to threaten you. It's not okay for someone to pursue an unwelcome sexual conversation. It's not okay for someone to touch you without your consent. So what does it take to translate the primal response that our baby self would have to cry out or pull away into effective self-protective action? Well, what we do in empowerment self-defense is we practice. We practice tuning into that internal alarm, sometimes after a lifetime of dismissing it. And we practice speaking up, taking action as soon as we hear the alarm sound. My favorite exercise is a drill called That's Close Enough. If I'm the student who's working, I'm helped by a partner who moves toward me. And my first job is to tune in to when my preference for personal space tells me that that person has gotten close enough. It's going to be different for each one of us. When somebody's standing closer to me than I like, my body tells me. My heart beats faster, my stomach flips, my hands get clammy, my mouth gets dry. When my body tells me that my partner has gotten as close as I want them to get, I put my hands up in the universal stop sign. I look them in the eye and I say, that's close enough. I don't need to know if something is definitely a pre-rape behavior before I take action. I just need to know that it's not okay with me. If something's not okay with me, I can leave. I can respond verbally. I can call for help. And if those things don't work, if the unwelcome behavior actually does escalate, I can intensify my response. I can match force for force. I'm already resisting, and I know fighting back works. In the world that I want to live in, possible pre-rape behaviors are not okay. So what if we practice rejecting them all the time? What would that mean? Well, for one thing, it would mean we stop setting up potential victims to run down the clock until they were absolutely sure that an assault was underway. And for another thing, it would mean we'd stop giving cover to those people truly intent on perpetrating sexual violence. If we agreed to stop minimizing and dismissing the everyday intrusions that are so easily confused with the early warning signs of sexual assault, perpetrators would stand out sooner. And that would give potential victims and their allies even more lead time to intervene, resist, and fight back. Now, to do this, we'd have to get used to saying things like, "That's not okay." "She said no." "I told you to stop." "Don't touch me." "Back off." You might be wondering if you can do this. You might be wondering if you've been dismissing your internal alarm for too long. You might be wondering if you're too shy or too anxious. You might be wondering if you can bear the awkwardness. You can. I know, because I and my colleagues have taught thousands of women, girls, transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary people, and others at risk of sexual violence. And this is what our students tell us. The greatest takeaway from empowerment self-defense is the ability to speak up when something's not okay with them. I want to leave you with the story of one of my self-defense students. She's an incredibly gentle and soft-spoken person. And I asked her class, imagine a setting when it would be especially difficult for you to speak up. Maybe you're afraid of hurting the person's feelings. Maybe you're worried about the social cost of making a scene. I asked them, what would make it possible for you to speak up anyway? I wish that you could look into the steely eyes of this young woman when she answered, because I know I'm right. Nobody knows better than you what is okay with you. You are the one and only expert on that. Armed with the truth about sexual violence, the behaviors that predict it, and empowered to take rapid, forceful action to respond to anything that sets off your internal alarm, you can do more than I ever dreamed of when I walked into that self-defense class. I just wanted to feel safe. With these truths, we can create a safer world for all of us.